Hello, and thank you for joining the Peach Education Conference as part of the 2021 virtual Southeast Regional Fruit and Vegetable Conference. I am Andy Rollins, County Extension Agent with Clemson University, and I will be your moderator for this session. Pesticide credits and CCA credits are available for most presentations and are offered during the live Southeast Regional Conference. Check the Pesticide CEU guide for a list of approved presentations and participating states. The Pesticide CEU guide is located in the Event Resources tab under the Media Player. The guide is also available at the Resource Center located in the main menu of the conference platform. Please note that pesticide credits will only be available for registered attendees and only during the live conference. Credits will not be available for on-demand viewing. There is a simple three-step process to receive pesticide credits and CCA credits. First, go to the audience chat box on the left side of your screen and type your first name, your last name, and the states for which you want to receive credits. Again, the audience chat box on the left-hand side of the screen, type your first name, your last name, and then the states you want credit for. You will need to do this for each presentation to request the pesticide credits. The second step is to sign out at the end of each presentation. So to sign out, go to the audience chat box again, follow the same procedure. Type your first name, your last name, and the states for which you're wanting credits. You will also be reminded at the end of each presentation to do this. The third and final step is to complete the pesticide CEU registration. You only have to complete this one time during the conference. This is not required for every presentation. To access this web link, the pesticide CEU registration web link, open the pesticide CEU guide on the Event Resources tab, which is located under the Media Player. The Pesticide CEU registration web link is located on the front cover of the guide. This presentation is being pre-recorded to reduce technical difficulties. We will be answering questions live at the end of this presentation. You can submit a question at any time during the presentation by typing a question into the question box and pressing send. Don't forget to thank our 2021 Southeast Regional Fruit and Vegetable Conference sponsors and exhibitors by visiting the virtual trade show and the featured products pavilion. These are the reasons why we're able to do this event. Lastly, don't forget to join us each morning for coffee chats and each evening for networking beginning at 5 p.m. Check the conference agenda for any additional details. Now I would like to introduce Dr. Phil Brannen. He is with the University of Georgia and will be presenting on bacterial spot management with copper and antibiotics. Dr. Brannen has extensive experience in disease management across multiple crops. He is the extension fruit pathologist for the state of Georgia and also teaches multiple plant disease classes. In peach, he has done extensive research with brown rot, peach scab, as well as bacterial problems. He is also a great speaker, one of whom I always enjoy learning from, and I'm sure you will also. Here's Dr. Brannen.
All right, thank you, Andy. I appreciate the opportunity to be with y'all virtually, if not in person. And I'm going to be talking to you today about bacterial spot, and we're calling this presentation the good, the bad, and the ugly, because there's a lot of ugly associated with bacterial spot, and also with the copper we use to control it as well. So bacterial spot is caused by Xanthomonas arboricula pathovar pruni. Not that you need to know that, but it's a bacterial disease. Very damaging disease, especially on some of the varieties like O. Henry. It can be very sporadic, based on weather, especially wet, warm weather following bloom. And it's very much dependent on that kind of moisture and temperature effect that we see at that time frame. If you're looking at bacterial spot control, the use of resistant varieties is actually great if you can do that. There are a lot of susceptible varieties out there, and a few that are in the mid-range and a few that are somewhat resistant. And that's really what we need for long-term control. So I'll say that that is the biggest single need that we have for the future is to have control through varieties. But these are some of the ones that, again, that we are always going to have problems with, O. Henry being one of them in particular is kind of the poster child. And the period from petal fall to second cover is actually very critical for control of this disease. As far as resistance, again, you can plant the resistant varieties. The problem there is a lot of the varieties you really want due to the color or other horticultural characteristics are not resistant. And they're bred in California, other places, and that becomes a problem because they don't have that disease there in any large degree. Anything you can do to reduce sand damage is going to be important because blowing wind, that sand will actually cut into the fruit or the leaves, and that's an open wound for the bacteria to get in. And sometimes just an excess of the land itself having a lot of sand in it may actually allow for guttation of the fruit itself or wetting that would actually allow for the infection also. But sand in particular from blowing wind is important. Always avoid using budwood from diseased orchards for propagation. Of course, we try to avoid that through our budwood program anyway. And then if you're looking at the disease cycle, there's some things you need to be aware of, and this may help you to think through how you can control this better. First of all, the bacteria enters into leaf scars that come out in the fall. So as soon as the leaves start to fall, there are those leaf scars there, and the bacteria can enter in. And from that, it will form black tip cankers or cankers that would last through the winter. But then in the spring, there's a critical, about a 30-day period where these cankers start to ooze. And with that, there will just be millions and billions of bacteria in any little droplet of that ooze that comes out. Of course, that can spread around with wind and rain as it occurs and pretty much cover your tree. We know that the primary leaf infections occur around petal fall, and then your primary fruit infections occur around shuck split. So the leaf infections are a little bit ahead of the fruit infections. And then the secondary infections continue to occur season long if conditions are wet, but there are some caveats even with that as well. So this slide is from Dave Ritchie. Dave's not going to be able to be with us this year, I don't think, but it's a black tip canker. And if you see that black on the end of that stem, that is a black tip canker, and that's caused by that bacteria going back in and forming a canker from earlier back in the fall. Now, this was on the 23rd of March, they took that photograph. That was in 2011, so it's been a while ago. You see here the spring canker that he shows you, a good diagrammatic of that. And then you see these spots that you would not necessarily identify as bacterial spot on those leaves. That's already occurring by the 6th of April. That's very early in the season. And I think that's a good slide to kind of show you how quickly this particular epidemic can be started. And then he also had some slides, again, this coming from Dave Ritchie, where he took some of these cankers and just shows he can get out pure bacteria out of that canker, but also from that leaf spot. And he blows that leaf up on the side. And you can see those spots. I would not necessarily look at that stage and identify that as bacterial spot. Because Dave worked with it so long, he knows that. And he can just show you can get out pure bacteria out of that. And then if you're starting to get into shuck split, the bacteria from the canker or the leaf can go immediately to that fruit. So if the conditions are right during that time frame for moisture and temperature, you're going to set yourself up for an early season epidemic, and that's critical. So again, the leaves are going to be important because you can defoliate, and I'll mention that earlier with this, or later with this pathogen. But we're really talking about fruit is what we're concerned about because defoliation is important. But I've rarely seen defoliation to the extent that it's going to damage the tree, just from bacterial spot alone. But fruit infections I have seen often, and that's what you got to take to market. So that's what you're going to be concerned about. And of course, if you get early season infections going on, you can see infections from bacterial spot very early. This is a young fruit that's already showing the oozing and some of the damage from bacterial spot. And then it gets worse as the season progresses. You can see here the leaf spots from bacterial spot, and then a peach relatively early. This was taken in June, and you can already see on this O. Henry how much damage is being done by the bacterial pathogen. And then, of course, later, this really does get ugly. So there's, the good, the bad, and the ugly. This is as ugly as it gets. but you certainly don't want to see that at the end of the season on your peach. Sometimes you'll see this type of a symptom. Now, this was actually late in the season, and it's hard to know whether this came in early and just didn't develop well or if it's a late season infection. But again, without regard, if you have this type of a bacterial spot problem, you're not going to be able to market that peach. So it's just a devastating disease in the years in which it does occur and on the varieties where it does occur. And again, the leaf infections I've mentioned, but you can get these early, and eventually you can't get enough of this. If these leaves get yellow, they will fall off, and you can get defoliation from this disease. But again, I would say that from my experience, I have not often seen with our spray programs where we have absolute defoliation where it's severe. But we definitely have more fruit infections that will keep your fruit from going to market, and that's where we really run into trouble. As far as the copper spray recommendations, we've had these basic types of recommendations in the guides for a long time. Now, this may have changed. I don't know, we've adjusted some of the rates. This is an older slide, but the general concept is still the same. You're going to have very high rates of copper prior to bloom, and then after bloom, you're going to have to reduce those rates of copper, or you will take off all the leaves with those higher rates of copper. So you're continually reducing the rates as you go. If you were to ask me, where do you want to target coppers if you can only put out like one or two? Probably the closer you can get to bloom, the better. If you put out early copper applications, the bacteria may have an opportunity to revive itself coming out of the cankers. So I like to kind of target these applications to make sure I get as close to bloom as possible without going into bloom. You can see here's one for the 5 to 10% blossoms open. But you don't want to damage your flowers, but nonetheless, you do definitely want to target it there. And then just as soon as you come out on the other side in the petal fall, when the leaves are starting to come out and get infected, you've got to have copper out at that point. You will get damage. There will be damage, and that's just part of the way it's going to be. As Dave Ritchie's always told us, if you don't see damage, it's probably not working. So again, if you're looking at one of the critical things for control of this disease, as well as we can do, because we in a really bad year, you're not going to control all of it. But that dormant application is going to be critical. And all the different coppers you can apply, they all should work pretty well as long as you're hitting with the right amount of metallic copper. So I'm not as concerned about the products as I am about the amount of metallic copper which we have in our guide and making sure that you hit those targets. And these are, you're just trying to reduce that initial inoculum that's coming out of those cankers, especially in the spring when those cankers start to come out and ooze. Then you're going to have a lot of bacteria. So you're trying to kill those organisms before they get in and cause damage. Just to show you what this can do or what it kind of looks like if you miss those pre-bloom applications. Again, this is somewhat anecdotal. This goes back to when we were testing almost 20 years ago, the Clemson model versus producer standard. But we had a couple of producers that did not get in these pre-bloom applications. And I know that it's anecdotal, but nonetheless, this is what we observed. Producer 2 here, and then also producer 4. They did not get in any of their pre-bloom applications of copper. And you can see how much disease they had. They had at least half of their fruit had pretty severe lesions that would have taken away the fruit from market. And this one here is even worse, I think, if you look at it. I mean, they just had a tremendous amount of damage. And those folks who had those pre-bloom applications just did not have those kind of issues. So that's always been a good warning to me that you need to make sure you get those copper applications in. If you're talking about when do I need to spray the most, again, you've got to intensify your program up front. Make sure you get in the copper applications prior to bloom and just after bloom. And then you also have to start with the oxytetracycline or antibiotics, and you hit Chucksplit along with some coppers. Because if you look at just the leaf, this is leaf data. It's old data coming back from Ron Gatitis and Paul Bertrand back in the 80s. So they actually applied bacteria at different stages to the peaches and then saw how much bacterial spot developed. So they put out the same amount of bacteria, but just saw how it would develop. And basically, there is showing that early on, right after the bloom and you're in that petal fall and choke split time frame, If you put out bacteria then, you're going to get a lot more disease. You can see this in the timing on these applications and when the disease develops. When you get out into April, it starts to go down. You put out the same applications and you don't see nearly as much. So again, just take home message that early season is going to be very important to what you set up for an epidemic for bacterial spot. The fruit infection period is a little bit similar. No, it's not dissimilar, I'd say. I mean, again, you want to make sure you're Johnny on the spot with your applications early in the season. We know from some other research that's been done that the fruit infections occur within a 3-week period following shuck split in particular. That's when a lot of them are going to occur. If you have rainfall and the right temperatures during that time frame, that's when you're going to get infection on the fruit. So precipitation which follows shuck split is particularly important. And then the optimum time for the bacteria to move in and to set up housekeeping in the fruit is approximately 3 weeks after shuck split. That does not mean you're completely out of the woods after that point, but it just says that early season early season application is going to be really critical to controlling this disease. And you've got to make sure you're getting in all the applications you need during that time frame. Again, if you see a dry year, once you get pretty close to pit hardening, you probably are not going to have that much bacterial spot. We can't tell you for sure that if you get to pit hardening, you're not going to have any if you haven't seen it. But we just know that it gets less and less and less as you go. And so that's a pretty good indicator that in a year in which especially it's dry and you haven't seen it, once you get to the pit hardening stage, hopefully you're out of the woods. Let me talk to you a little bit more about copper. So, copper is good and bad. It does help to control bacterial spot. We know that at low rates during the cover sprays, it can be active and can be as good or in trials it's looked as good as tetracycline when you compare it. So low rates of copper can be part of the solution, but you can also get this type of damage from the copper itself, and that can defoliate the tree for sure if you put enough out and keep doing it. So we did a spray trial back about 10 years ago, and I've shown some of this data previously, but I want to kind of go back over it again. And we're looking at 3 different varieties. And if you look at the rates, the actual labeled rates are the 1/4 pound to 1/2 pound per acre. Okay, so that's 1.2 ounces of phthalic copper and 2.4 ounces. That's what's on the label for COSIDE. We've generally done a lot of our testing at a lower rate. That 0.125 or 0.6 ounce is about where we've done a lot of the testing, where we've looked at bacterial spot management and cover sprays. Nonetheless, labels actually higher. In this trial, we put out a total of 5 applications, about a week apart, and then we reported the phytotoxicity. So out of this, you can look at these 3 different varieties, but what I wanted to point out is the amount of defoliation. If you look at the COSIDE at the 1/2 pound rate, and you look at the O. Henry and the July prints and the amount of defoliation that we got off that trial, I don't think a peach tree needs that. I think that's just too much. That's just too hot. And so if you're seeing that kind of damage or seeing a lot of damage, once you start to defoliate a tree like that, if it's an older tree, I think you stand a chance of killing it. I think they just get too stressed. Younger trees can probably recover, but I don't like seeing that much copper damage. That would be significant. But you can just see what copper will do. Now, if you're at that lower rate, you could probably stand that. Even with the 5 applications in a row weekly, you're going to have some defoliation, you're going to have some copper damage, but that might be okay, and hopefully that'll be enough to suppress your bacterial spot. This is just showing what that looked like. If you look on the far right, you can see how sparse the foliage is in these young trees. The copper will definitely take the leaves off of the tree if you use it a lot. So it's a good tool that we can have in the cover sprays, but it is also dangerous from the perspective of leaf removal. We've also done some more recent testing where I've looked at copper at the horticulture farm. This is from this last year, just showing some of the copper damage on some of the rates that we utilized there. In 2018, we had a test out of the horticulture farm, and I wanted to point out mainly the fact that, well, 2 things. One, we know that with the COSIDE, it does reduce disease. You can look on the fruit assessment on the far right there, and you look at the untreated compared to the co-side. And in both times where we had co-side in there, we had a couple of treatments with co-side, and we used that 0.125 pound rate. That's a little bit lower than the label, but that's what we were utilizing in that trial. And so we reduced the reduced the bacterial spot by about half. So a pretty significant reduction in what we saw there as far as the number of fruit that were infected, and also the lesions per fruit. So it does help significantly. It also caused a lot more phytotoxicity. So if you look at the leaf phytotoxicity that we observed and the foliation, even though that's a pretty low rate, you do get some. And so just pointing that out, again, we know that's going to happen, but it does also control bacterial spot or suppress it anyway. If you're looking at damage, again, this is mainly, I just want to show you some of the damage we got out of these trials. Now, this was a pretty intensive trial, so I'm only going to point out a couple of things. One, you utilize co-side 3000, and that's copper hydroxide, badge, which is copper oxychloride and copper hydroxide, and then master cop, which is copper sulfate pentahydrate. Now, a lot of the products that are out there, they'll claim they don't cause as much damage. I think that the bottom line is, if you look at the metallic copper and you put out metallic copper at equivalent rates, you will cause equivalent damage, and hopefully you'll also get equivalent bacterial spot control. But I have not seen any copper that will not cause damage. Now, some of these were touted as not causing damage, and they actually cause just as much damage. That's what I want to show you. So if you look at the copper phytotoxicity assessments, as you increase rates on either badge or master cop, and you compare that to the co-side program, you're going to see just as much damage or more, depending on how much metallic copper you have in there. So when you have a chance, look at that slide, and you can kind of see what I'm talking about. But it just there is going to be damage. Metallic copper is the critical thing to be looking at. You can also look at defoliation. And again, if you look at that master cop where you're at the 1 pint, and we put that out quite a few times. We put out a petal fall, shuck split, and then we had 7 cover sprays. Now, we took off about half those leaves on that tree. And the tree did not look good. I can tell you, anytime you do that, the trees do not look healthy at that point. So any of these products, whether it's badge or co-side or a master cop, if you spray it that often, you're going to cause damage. So let's talk about MycoShield real quick. So MycoShield is your other product you can utilize. It's an oxytetracycline antibiotic. You can spray it weekly up to about 3 weeks prior to harvest. We do know some things about it that are bad, though. So sunlight, if you look at sunlight, it's going to actually take off all the MycoShield pretty quickly. So you're not going to get the coverage for 7 days that you need probably with MycoShield by itself. It's just not going to be there. Hopefully you're going to knock the bacteria back enough, though, so you can prevent infection. And again, this just reiterates that under full sunlight, you're going to drop your residue by about 40% at day 1 and 80% at day 2 post-application when it's at full sunlight. Or some of the fruit would be covered by leaves as well, so it wouldn't be in full sunlight, but it all drops. When you look at water, rainfall, oxytetracycline does not go into the fruit or the leaf at all. It is not systemic. If you have any kind of rainfall, even 2 minutes afterwards, you're going to get essentially none of it there. So it's going to wash off immediately. So that was proven also. So within 2 minutes of having the rain applied, 65% is going to be gone. So you can't count on oxytetracycline to be there after rain. And when do you need it? When it's wet. So one of the things that so how do you utilize all this as far as information? Normally, Lancet Rutgers, he recommends that you actually alternate copper with oxytetracycline. And I don't know that there's a better way to do that. I think that's probably a good recommendation. That way you don't cause so much damage with the copper, and you're keeping something on the plant. Because the copper does build up, at least you have some copper if the oxytetracycline washes off or gets reduced by sunshine. So I think that's a good possibility in the cover sprays. You can also put those out together, but again, if you use the copper too much, I'm just concerned you're going to take off far too much of your leaves and cause damage with that as well. So that's kind of what I think I would do in the cover sprays myself, is kind of follow Norm's recommendation. And with that, I've pretty much completed everything I have to say. But again, just to reiterate, critical to use the coppers in the period prior to bloom and then just after, petal fall and shuck split. Make sure that you have some copper on the spot there, because you're trying to reduce the initial inoculum of the bacteria coming out of those cankers and oozing out of those cankers. Going into the cover sprays, you have two options still. You have copper and you have antibiotics. So if you utilize those effectively, hopefully by alternating, we can prevent resistance from developing in either one of those. That's one of the other issues we have to be contending with now, is the possibility of resistance developing. So that's another thing that could actually reduce our bacterial spot control over the years. The big thing we got to have coming is resistance. And I'd say that is the one thing that's going to help us out of a hole with bacterial spot. With that, I would take questions.